Grinding your own spices at home is a great way to take your cooking to the next level. Because of course you can buy pre-ground spices or even spice blends at the supermarket, but sometimes their flavor can be a little on the dull side. But when you toast and grind your own from whole spices, the flavors really come alive. And that really matters when you're making simple recipes like I'm doing today, starting off with 5-spice candied bacon. Now to follow that up, a simple recipe of couscous and chicken, we're going to make our own harissa. And then I'm going to show you how easy it is to make a yellow Indian curry powder to make skillet vegetable curry. And last but definitely not least, we're gonna make a masala chai concentrate to make a panna cotta. So we're gonna get started with the bacon, and this is great if you're having people over because you can add it to a cheese board. It's a great appetizer and people go crazy for it. And we're gonna start by making our own 5-spice powder. Starting off with Szechuan peppercorns. Now, if you can't find these, you can easily use white peppercorns, but Szechuan peppercorns are special because they make your mouth tingle. They're not spicy, but your brain interprets that tingle as heat, so they're just fun. So we're gonna start by putting 8 teaspoons, the Szechuan peppercorns, in the spice grinder, 5 teaspoons of fennel seeds. We're gonna add a tablespoon of cloves. We're gonna buzz these up. An electric spice grinder is really nice here because you get a nice fine powder. Ah, that is perfect. I'm gonna put this in a bowl. Now for the star anise. We want 8 pieces of star anise. We're gonna add 1 cinnamon stick. To give it a head start, we're gonna break it as best you can. All right, let's take a look. That looks pretty good. All right, woo! The spices are just so strong and potent and flavorful when you grind them yourself. You really can't buy anything that smells this good. Now, this will hold for a little bit in your pantry. You have to store it in glass, however, because there are compounds found in the cloves and the star anise that will break down plastic over time. So you need to use glass. All right, on to the bacon. So candied bacon has kind of become all the rage these days, and with good reason. It's easy to make and it blows people's minds, especially if you serve it as an appetizer on a simple cheese board. So here I have some brown sugar. It's a 1/4 cup of brown sugar. Now you don't want to use dark brown sugar here because that'll burn. To the sugar, we're going to add a teaspoon of our freshly ground 5-spice and a teaspoon of freshly ground black pepper. Gonna mash the spices into the brown sugar. All right, on to the bacon. You need 12 ounces of bacon, and if you buy center cut bacon, I find that the pieces are cut a little more evenly so they cook at the same rate. This is how I cut bacon in half. I just use a pair of scissors. I go right through the packaging. Nice and easy. You want the little pieces of bacon because they cook more evenly. You're gonna spread them out on 2 foil-lined rim baking sheets that I have already prepped. Just wanna spread the bacon out, give it a lot of room to cook evenly. So we're gonna sprinkle the sugar mixture evenly over the top of each piece. All right, now I'm gonna go back through and just spread it out evenly. And spending the time to do this, to spread it out evenly, really pays off in the end because you get this nice even coating of candy right on the top of the bacon. Last, we're gonna sprinkle a few sesame seeds right over the top of each piece. All right, just a few. I find this easier to do with a little spoon. Now these are ready for the oven, 350 degrees, 2 racks obviously. Takes about 20 to 25 minutes for the bacon to cook through and the sugar on top to candy. Obviously, I'll switch and rotate the pans halfway through, and I often find that one pan is done before the other, so just be on the lookout for that. The bacon has come out of the oven and it's fragrant and bubbly. Of course, you have to let it cool at least 10 minutes before you serve it, or else you will burn the heck out of your mouth. And I know that for a reason. But it's hard to hold back because it just smells so good. So using a spatula, you want to pick it up, you can see as it cools, it gets nice and stiff and candied. And the more it cools, the firmer it gets. This is what I like to call my guilty pleasures cheese board. It's pimento cheese, which is nice and rich, sometimes a little spicy. Rice crackers, which kind of go with the pimento cheese, let it stand out, and with the 5 spice on the bacon, and some pickled vegetables. All right, that looks good for the cheese board. We'll save that other tray for everyone at home because Marta and Ian go crazy for it. All right, right off the bat. You taste the bacon and the 5 spice really comes through. Ooh, I'm getting a little tingle of the Szechuan peppercorn on my tongue. So much fun. Coming up, I'm gonna show you how to make a simple skillet couscous and chicken dinner flavored with harissa.
At Cooks Illustrated, we're food nerds. That's why every recipe we develop involves research, cooking science, and rigorous testing by our team of expert test cooks. Only the highest rated recipes earn a place in our award-winning magazine. Every issue features our latest recipes and discoveries, cooking tips, and equipment and ingredient reviews. Our step-by-step photos and hand-drawn illustrations show you exactly how to succeed. So, are you ready to become the best cook you know? Subscribe to Cooks Illustrated magazine at cooksillustrated.com today.
Harissa is kind of new to me. I've only gotten to know it in the past few years, and I find myself using it in everything from fried eggs to pudding, a little in salad dressings. It's a spice blend mixed with some olive oil, and you can buy it at the store. In fact, I've done that. But I found the brands at the store really vary widely, and I prefer to make my own. You combine 6 tablespoons of extra virgin olive oil, 6 garlic cloves, 2 tablespoons of paprika, 1 tablespoon each ground coriander and dried Aleppo pepper, a teaspoon of ground cumin, 3/4 of a teaspoon of caraway seed, and 1/2 teaspoon of salt in a glass jar or bowl, and microwave it on high till it's fragrant and bubbly, which takes about a minute. So here is the homemade harissa. It's nice and cooled. I'm gonna take a tablespoon of it. I'm gonna add it to this bowl, which has 2 tablespoons of apricot preserves. And we're gonna add a tablespoon of olive oil to this. And this mixture is gonna play double duty. Some of it's gonna go into the couscous for flavoring it, and some of it's gonna be a glaze for the chicken. Stir this together. Get out any clumps of the apricot preserves. All right, now, most of this is the glaze, but I'm gonna take a tablespoon out and we're gonna build some flavorings for the couscous. All right, so we'll set this aside for the glaze. Tablespoon goes into this bowl. We're gonna add a little fresh garlic. Of course, I'm gonna use a rasp grater, because I like how finely it grates the garlic. It just melds really nicely into the vinaigrette. We're gonna add some currants and some fresh lemon. Again, using the rasp style grater. We're gonna add some fresh lemon zest. Remember, the first time I tried this recipe, I was kind of blown away how much flavor this gives the couscous, which is, when you think about it, it's just plain pasta. Now we're gonna juice the lemon, squeeze the juice right into the harissa currant mixture. And that is it for this mixture. Now it's time for the chicken itself. Boneless, skinless breasts. They're on the small side, about 6 ounces or so. We're just gonna saute them to get things started. Before you do that, we're gonna season it with a little salt and pepper. We're gonna add that glaze for the harissa after they've cooked. That really preserves its nice bright flavor. All right, let's head to the stove and get cooking. So I have a tablespoon of oil in here, heating up over medium-high heat. You wanna see just some smoke before you add the chicken. That's how you know you're gonna get a good sear. Notice I'm kind of taking the chicken and pushing it around in the skillet. I wanna make sure there's oil underneath the chicken. That just helps prevent it from sticking, even though it's a non-stick pan. Oh, you can see a nice golden brown. So I'm just gonna flip it over. Keep on cooking the second side. Been a few minutes on that second side, and now is when I changing of the tongs, because those tongs I used when the chicken was raw, you don't want to use the same ones when they're cooked. So new tongs, new spoon rest. All right, now the way to tell if your chicken is done is it registers 160 degrees in the very center. Oh, on the money. All right, we're gonna transfer these to a carving board. That is a nicely sauteed chicken breast. Here is the glaze. You just want to brush it right on, let it melt. Because again, we have the apricot preserves in there, so it'll sort of warm up and melt a little bit and just baste the chicken with flavor. Just gonna tent this with foil, let it rest while we go back to the skillet. We're gonna make the couscous using the fond from the chicken because that's just good flavor. So in goes some water. And while that comes to a boil, you wanna scrape up any of that delicious fond on the bottom of the pan. Basically, you're making chicken broth or a type of chicken broth at this point. That water has come up to a boil. Time to add the couscous. Look how dark that water, or broth I should start calling it, is. There's just so much flavor in that skillet, and it's nice not to lose it, but rather capture it and put it in a side dish. All right, couscous goes in. The couscous doesn't need to cook, it just needs to rehydrate. So turn off the heat, put the lid on, and let this sit for about 5 minutes. All right, this couscous has been resting off the heat. Now in goes the harissa currant mixture that we made earlier. It has a little bit of the preserves in there, some lemon, a little garlic. Also, we're gonna add some salt and pepper. Now you could add this to the harissa mixture, or you could add it right now. All right, now I'm gonna use a fork and just flip off the couscous and stir in some of that harissa mixture. And one last thing we're adding, some pistachios. And these are toasted pistachios. It's nice to fluff the couscous with a fork, but for stirring, move to something that's not gonna scrape up the pan too much. So that is the couscous. Now let's go over to our chicken that's been resting here. I'm gonna slice it all up and layer it right on top of the couscous. My friend's right behind me. He knows when it's eating time. You're no fool, huh, Ziggs? Just gonna put this right on top of the couscous. So I'm using the knife not only to transport the chicken to the couscous, but also to scrape up any of the juices and any of the glaze that's on the cutting board, because all that is really good flavor. And the last little garnish is some fresh mint. So I'm just picking some of the mint leaves. I'm just gonna use my fingers to tear them up and just sprinkle them right on top. Looks pretty good. And that's it, a really simple recipe, all in one skillet for couscous with chicken, but flavored with that beautiful harissa. I know it's just a simple sauteed chicken, but that harissa glaze at the end really just kicked things up a notch. The couscous, it has the harissa, it has really lemony, a little bit of garlic. It's just a great compilation of flavors and textures. Coming up, I'm gonna show you how easy it is to make an Indian-style curry powder and use it to make a bright, vibrant vegetable curry. Indian-style yellow curry has been one of my favorite flavors ever since I was a little kid. So I've known how to make curry powder for a long time, and this is the one I usually keep on hand in my kitchen because it's mild and you can use it for a lot of different recipes. So to make your own curry powder, you wanna start with whole spices, starting with coriander seeds. We're gonna have 2 tablespoons. Again, I'm using the spice grinder here to grind whole spices because they just taste so much better than the pre-ground stuff. A tablespoon and a half of cumin seeds, a tablespoon of yellow mustard seeds, and a teaspoon and a half of black peppercorns. Okay, we're gonna grind this up into a nice fine powder. Oh, that's perfect. Oh, you can't beat that smell. All right, now a few more spices we're gonna add. These are the ground versions. We're gonna add a tablespoon and a half of turmeric, a teaspoon of ground ginger, and a little bit of cinnamon, just a quarter of a teaspoon. Just gonna whisk this all together, breaking up any clumps. I'm gonna transfer this to a spice jar so that it holds nicely. Try not to make too much of a mess. All right, so that's a lot of curry powder. We're gonna use some of it in our vegetable curry. You do need some fresh ginger, fresh jalapeno, and fresh garlic. So, easiest way to peel ginger, using the spoon, because that ginger skin is so thin, it just kinda scrapes away really easily. Now to prep the ginger, I love using a rasp style grater because it's the easiest way. So I'm just gonna grate it right into a bowl. You want about a tablespoon of fresh ginger for this recipe. Next up, some garlic. I'm gonna give it the same treatment as I did the ginger. The last fresh aromatic we're gonna use for this curry is a nice jalapeno. This is a big old jalapeno, but it's okay because I like the fresh jalapeno flavor. Just gonna trim off the stem, cut it in half. Now, whether or not you include the seeds and the ribs on the inside, that's up to you. It's the ribs that have a lot of the heat. Now I'm just gonna take the jalapeno and mince it up. All right, and there's the jalapeno. So we've got the jalapeno, the ginger, and the garlic. Putting them in the same bowl because they're all gonna go into the skillet at the same time. We have one more thing to prep before we can start cooking, and that is some tomatoes. Now, you want a nice loose canned tomato product. You don't want a lot of it. So you want a 14.5-ounce can of whole peeled tomatoes in their juice. We're just gonna put them into a blender. You could use a food processor. You just wanna pulse them until there's no large chunks. I like using a blender because it's meant for liquids and it's just less messy. Oh, you can see that texture, that's what you're looking for. All right, we're all prepped. It's time to start cooking. Now here I have a 12-inch nonstick skillet and I have a 1/4 cup of vegetable oil. Heating up medium heat, you just want it to be shimmering because the first thing we're gonna do is add the spices and really let them bloom and flavor the oil. We're gonna add 1.5 tablespoons of our freshly ground curry powder. We're also gonna add another spice blend, some garam masala, just a teaspoon. We're just gonna cook these for about 30 seconds, just until they're nice and fragrant. Oh, I love that smell. Now we're gonna add some potatoes. These are just red potatoes that I've cut up into cubes. And we're gonna add 1 chopped onion. We're also gonna add just a little bit of salt. All right, we're just gonna cook this, stirring every so often till the onions are really nicely tender and brown. And the potatoes have just started to cook through. That takes about 10 minutes. Those onions have softened, they're starting to get brown around the edges, which is just perfect. Time to add our fresh aromatics. Again, that's the ginger, the garlic, and the jalapeno. We're also gonna add a tablespoon of tomato paste. Before you add the liquid, you really wanna give them a quick saute. Again, only about 30 seconds, just until you smell that garlic and the ginger. That smells so good. That's it for that. Now time to add the pureed tomatoes. And a cup of water. Make sure that's nice and combined. Before we add the cauliflower, this cauliflower I cut into nice bite-sized pieces, obviously so it could fit onto a fork. So that goes right in. And I have a can of chickpeas that I drained and rinsed, and in they go. So you want to stir the cauliflower and the chickpeas in, make sure they're submerged and they're covered with the sauce. And then bring it to a simmer, which it kind of does right off the bat. I'm gonna put the lid on, reduce the heat to medium-low, and let it go until the potatoes and the cauliflower are tender, which takes anywhere from 12 to 18 minutes. All right, it's been about 12 minutes. Now to tell if the potatoes and the cauliflower are done, you can just use a dinner fork. Oh yeah, the fork's just sliding right through. Gonna add some frozen peas. No need to thaw the peas because the heat in the skillet will thaw them on its own. All right, time to finish it with some coconut milk. Now we're just gonna let this simmer about a minute or two until the peas are heated through and the sauce thickens ever so slightly. It's been just a few minutes for those peas to heat through and the coconut milk to meld into this sauce. Now, last you want to add a little bit of cilantro, or in my house, a lot of cilantro. That is my herb of choice. All right, now to serve it, I just like using a little basmati rice in a wide bowl. Some rice on the bottom of the bowl to catch the sauce. Then a little island off to the side so you can sauce it up as you like. A little cilantro on top. Oh, get some sauce. Just a little rice. You just can't beat homemade curry powder. It just has so much more flavor. And it's a relatively simple dish, not a lot of flavors going on. It's vegetables. And so that homemade curry powder really just makes it come alive. Coming up last, I'm gonna show you how to make Panna Cotta using a homemade masala chai concentrate. Love what you're watching? Take your cooking to the next level with our Essential membership. Get instant access to thousands of recipes, tips, techniques, product reviews, and step-by-step videos. Our Members app allows you to search by ingredient, set dietary preferences, and save your favorite recipes. For those looking to level up, our newest feature, ATK Classes, offers more in-depth instruction led by ATK experts so you can gain greater confidence in the kitchen. Start your free trial by visiting the App Store or going to americastestkitchen.com/YouTube today. It's time to make Panna Cotta, but we're gonna make it chai flavored. And we're gonna make our own chai concentrate. Now I'm gonna take whole spices and crush them myself because it results in bigger pieces that you can strain out of the chai. If you grind up, you wind up with sort of a powdery mouthfeel, and that's not good. So we're gonna use a mortar and pestle. We're gonna start with some cinnamon. So we're gonna put 3 pieces of cinnamon in there. We're gonna put 1 star anise in. Now for the green cardamom pods, you want about 15 of those. In they go. 2 teaspoons of whole cloves and 3/4 of a teaspoon of black peppercorns. All right, so now we're just gonna crush this. I found over the years that I really have to put my hand over the top or else spices fly out. So again, not crushing it to a fine powder. All right. Oh, that smells good. So now I'm gonna put it into a saucepan. Now we're gonna toast the spices in the saucepan. Medium heat, 1 to 2 minutes. The spices will start to smoke ever so slightly and you'll really be able to smell it. It'll be very fragrant, and that's when you wanna add the water. All right, those spices are toasted. Time to add 5 cups of water. Oh yeah. We're also gonna add some brown sugar. This is 1/4 cup of light brown sugar. Next up, a tablespoon of chopped fresh ginger and just a pinch of salt. Now we're gonna bring this to a boil and let it simmer for about 10 minutes before adding the tea, because the tea releases its flavor much more quickly into the water. The spices need a little extra time. Okay, that's been simmering for 10 minutes. Time to add the tea. Now I like using this English breakfast tea, but a heartier tea like Assam would also work well. You want to add 3 tablespoons of loose black tea. You want to stir this in, and again, we're going to simmer it, but this time covered, another 10 minutes. All right, this has been simmering for 10 minutes with the tea. Keeping the lid on, sliding it off the heat, and we're gonna let it steep for another 10 minutes before straining. This chai has been steeping for 10 minutes. So now I'm just straining the chai, any of the tea from the saucepan. Oh, a little spillage. Press lightly on the spices. You don't want to press too much because that's when things can get bitter. All right, now we have some chai concentrate. So we're gonna let that cool while we get the milk ready for the panna cotta. Now panna cotta is an Italian dessert, and it's really just milk flavored in some way and then thickened with gelatin. So we're gonna start by mixing it with sugar. This is 1/4 cup of sugar. There we go. And now for the gelatin. 2 teaspoons is the perfect amount. There's 1. And there we go, there's 2. We're also gonna add a pinch of salt. Now we're gonna whisk this together. There we go. Now we're gonna add the milk, just a cup of whole milk. I'm gonna whisk this in, and then we're gonna let this mixture set. That hydrates the gelatin. You have to let it sit for about 5 minutes. Then we're gonna take it to the stove and heat it up. That'll dissolve the gelatin and the sugar. I'm gonna heat it to about 150, 160 degrees, thereabouts. And then we're gonna let it cool a little bit before mixing it with the chai. All right, this gelatin mixture has cooled, And now it's time to mix it with the chai. Now I'm not using all that chai concentrate I made. You only need about 2 cups for this panna cotta. So this is cooled. I'm gonna strain it into the chai. I don't expect to catch a lot in this strainer, just any bits of gelatin that didn't fully dissolve. Looks like I didn't get a 1. All right, that just ensures that the finished panna cotta has a really smooth texture. So gently stir this. All right, now into our cups they go. These pudding cups I think are 5 or 6 ounces. If you had a bigger wine glass, that'd be fine too. So I'm just dividing this mixture evenly. This makes enough for 8. All right, so this gelatin needs to set up, obviously, and that takes at least 6 hours in the fridge, but you can make this up to 3 days in advance if you're throwing a party, which I find really handy. So I'm just gonna cover this with plastic wrap and put it in the refrigerator. All right, here are the finished panna cotta. Now, I know they look a little liquidy when you jiggle it, but you have to trust that the gelatin has set as long as you've given it enough time. So there's lots of ways to garnish these. So here I have some toasted shredded coconut and just a little dark chocolate. That's how I like it. Let me show you the texture. Oh, that's perfect. See how it sits on the spoon? It's like on the edge of going over the edge of the spoon, but it holds its shape. That's what you want in a perfect panna cotta. It's cold, it's smooth, and the chai has the perfect blend of spices. You get cinnamon, cardamom, little clove, just a little sweet bite after a nice meal. I hope you've enjoyed watching how to put spices to work in your kitchen. See you next time. If you're ready to take your cooking to the next level, head over to americastestkitchen.com and get a free trial of our ATK Essential membership. While you're there, you can sign up for our free email newsletters and download our app. So, what are you waiting for?